Morning, Andrew. Andrew Muncrist, welcome back. I believe that we had you in committee last year when we were taking testimony on H706.
That is correct.
And we're interested in anything you might want to share with us today on the rules that are in development that came out of that bill. And we heard the other day some testimony from the Xerxes Society. So we're on the same subject here. And we've got a few folks who are zooming in, and I'll keep an eye on the Zoom screen in case anybody has a question. But maybe you could just start, Andrew, by introducing yourself, and we're happy to hear whatever you have to say.
Well, first off, thanks for the invite. My name is Andrew Muncrist, and I am a commercial beekeeper from Cornwall, Vermont. Most recently, I served as the president of the Vermont Beekeepers Association. I'm currently the immediate past president. I stay on for continuity of operations with the VBA, and in that position, I've been handling the testimony on this bill and following the developments as it's enacted in the rulemaking process. So I followed Emily May from Xerxes, her testimony pretty closely. And I would have to say that her comments align pretty closely with the VBA's stance on this. So I won't go through that all again, except to say that we strongly support what she said. And I will add a few points which are specific to beekeeping and some that just bear covering a second time. One is in the rules, the definitions of IPM are problematic. There seems to be no real comprehension of how IPM operates in the field or how it's intended to operate. And specifically, there's no discussion of thresholds above which a treatment should be used. And lacking that single statement defeats the entire purpose of IPM. As beekeepers, we're used to having pretty severe economic damage basically every year, and we can tolerate a certain amount, and we don't really get any choice. There's nothing we can do above a certain percentage, but the general agreed upon threshold is somewhere between 15 and 25% loss of colonies. And you would, in true IPM, you would do a similar thing. You could say, well, I could lose up to 5% of my crop. I could lose up to 10% of my crop. And that's the economic threshold at which it's justifiable to use an economic poison to control the pests that are in this crop. In the current paradigm, that's very difficult to do because all of the seeds are treated prophylactically. They're used on the field. So those definitions of IPM are problematic. With Act 182, hopefully there will become an availability of non-treated or seed treated with other chemicals than neonics. And farmers will be able to make informed choices based on that economic threshold that they find when they're scouting fields. So that's the first comment. The second comment about integrated pest management, it says choose an appropriate rate of insecticide seed treatment that can effectively manage target pests without over-application. Again, this is a misunderstanding of the entire process because the seed is treated at the manufacturer. The rate is determined by the manufacturer of the seed, and the farmer at the end has no say in how much neonic is applied. So again, this is kind of a meaningless statement here that has no basis in what's actually happening. What the farmer could choose is to use the anthranilic diamides instead of using the neonics, or to use seed that has no treatment at all. But choosing, I'm not sure why that piece is even in there because that's not something an individual farmer would get to choose. Any questions about the IPM comments?
Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, Andrew, does the agency in the rulemaking here or even in statute, is there a definition of IPM?
Yes, they do. They do include a definition of IPM. In the version that I have, it says IPM means a sustainable science-based decision-making process that combines biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools to identify, manage, and reduce risk from pests, and utilizes pest management tools and strategies that minimize overall economic, health, and environmental risks. That's a fairly boilerplate definition. And again, as I said before, it doesn't include the 4 basic steps, the first of which is to determine the action threshold at which something should be done to deal with pests.
Is there a definition of IPM, an EU one or a Ontario or Quebec one that is much more detailed and that the VBA would approve?
Yes, and I can send that to you or to the chair, however you'd prefer to do that. I don't have it in front of me right now because I've got the Zoom screen up, but I can absolutely, the VBA can send that to you.
You're welcome to send it to us. I will just, point out or remind all of us that at this point, this is sort of out of our hands, at least for the moment. The legislature is about to recess for the year and hopefully for the year. But I imagine you've been providing input to the agency, Andrew, or feedback, and
we did provide input. Basically, less than 5% of what we suggested and what Xerxes suggested was included in the draft BMPs. There will be a public comment period at some point. ICAR was delayed and postponed, so they're kind of running out the clock on us. But when there is a public comment period, we will submit that again in the public comment period.
Right. John, are you all set with your question?
Yeah, no, if you could send that would be great to the committee.
Yeah, I understand at this point that your hands are largely tied, but I truly appreciate that you are trying to stay informed on the process and to gather different viewpoints.
Was there more that you had, Andrew?
Yes. There's a number of recommendations in this, and in fact, in their headline, they say basically these are recommended best practice to be used wherever reasonable and practical. And I just kind of like to point out that really some of this is pre-ban, right? So some of this is from July 1st of this year to 2029. And that's an awful long time to go with these simply being recommended. There's a lot of things in here that should say shall rather than should. These are pretty important. They're especially important to beekeepers. And you can think of it like the risk from driving too fast on a roadway. If the signs said suggested speed limit, 50 miles an hour, you'd get a very different response than when it's a rule. And I would like to see these recommendations be more than just suggestions that can be used if you want to when it's reasonable and practical. These should be enforceable rules. There's an issue with the dates. I think Emily covered that pretty well. VBA is also very concerned about disposal. I've seen a couple different versions of it, and I know ANR weighed in on some setbacks for disposal. Personally, the idea of burying leftover treated seed scares the dickens out of me. That the fact that this stuff is so water soluble and it's systemic and it persists for years, I would personally like to see any leftover seed go into a clay-lined landfill to be sealed up rather than be buried in somebody's backyard behind the barn and hope that it doesn't end up getting in the water table, because we know that it moves through the water. We know that it moves through aquifers, and there's been some fairly spectacular bee kills when neonics have been disposed of incorrectly throughout the country. So disposal is certainly top of mind. Another point I'd like to touch on is aerial spraying. VBA would really like to see the aerial spraying of neonics banned in the rulemaking process. This stuff is just too lethal. It's exquisitely toxic to honeybees, and some native pollinators are even more sensitive than honeybees. And to be spraying it in that way, they include, that if you fly 10 feet over the canopy, it can be applied aerially. That is still just way too much drift, way too much risk. If we're going to be using this stuff in a broadcast spraying type situation, at least let it be done from the ground where it can be controlled a little bit better. The last piece that I'd like to deals with specifically with beekeeping. In the version I've got, it's section 305, and it's called Communication and Continuous Education. It says any person using an insecticide-treated article seed should provide at least 48 hours advance notice to all apiculturists who have established apiary on the premises. That's a pretty interesting statement. And if you don't mind, I'll kind of pick that apart. First off, aside from the challenge on the part of the farmer to know when they're going to be planting treated seed, the idea of notifying the beekeeper and that being useful to the beekeeper in any way is kind of mistaken. The apiary, well, let's compare with a treated seed application with a foliar application. If you have, let's use the example of mosquito spraying. A few years back, the state sprayed for Triple E and West Nile virus, and all of the beekeepers were notified. And they were using a product which degrades, its half-life is less than 24 hours. By morning, there were no detectable levels of the pesticide that they used in the dew droplets on plants. And so those of us in the spray path were able to cover hives with sheets the night before. They sprayed at night, and we were able to pull the sheets off in the morning, and the bees were able to avoid the worst effects of the spray. That's a situation where notification is extremely useful and is essential. In the case of planting of treated seeds, the damage done is dust getting on field adjacent crops, neonics being taken up by the water and getting into nectar bearing plants adjacent to the field, nectar bearing plants within the field margins, or the actual pollen and nectar of the field crop itself. And that happens over a period of months. And in fact, it can happen in the crop that's planted in the field the following year. So a notification of the planting event is only useful in the case of acute toxicity of bees flying through the dust cloud that is created by the planter. And that does happen, but that's a pretty minor loss of bees in comparison with the damage that's done over the course of the full season. And this is the best management practice that is recommended starting July 1st, 2025. And my opinion would be that that's not necessary. We already know as beekeepers that the cornfields are toxic. We've already shifted bee yards away from areas that are heavily planted to corn. Those of us that are unable to have gotten used to losing as many as all of our colonies in areas adjacent to corn every year, and we've gotten used to that. This will be no change. What would be extremely useful is after the ban goes into effect in 2029, it would be extremely useful for beekeepers to know when exemptions to use neonic treated seed have been granted, because the landscape will change. We will once again be able to safely keep bees in areas where there is heavy row cropping. The row crops will no longer be nearly as toxic to the honeybees. The anthranilic diamides, which are available as a seed treatment currently, they're as effective against seed corn maggot as the neonics, but they are 2 orders of magnitude less toxic than the neonics to honeybees. So we're not concerned about those, but it would be extremely useful to know when an exemption has been granted and a farmer is going to go back to planting neonic seeds. And it doesn't need to happen within 48 hours of planting, because it's not the planting event that's the problem. And that doesn't really leave the beekeeper time to address the issue. If I got a notification from a farmer saying, hey, I'm going to plant neonic seeds, I got an exemption to plant clothianidin treated seed in this field that's 500 yards from your apiary, then I would have the choice. If I got that notification as soon as the farmer bought the seed or as soon as they were granted the exemption, I could move my bees out of that apiary and I could not use it for the whole season, because the toxicity from that seed treatment is going to last that whole season. It's nothing that can be ameliorated by my covering my hives with a sheet for a night. So if I were to write that rule, I would have it not go into effect until 2029. And I would have it be beekeepers within a mile radius of a field that has been granted an exemption would get notified. When we've been testing pollen collected by bees, we've found anywhere from half a mile up to a mile and a half, bees are collecting pollen and getting poisoned by neonic treated seed in field crops. And so this business about it being on the property is pretty silly, because the pesticide drift and the movement of the neonics doesn't respect property lines. So it should be about distance from the state Agency of Agriculture has a map of all the apiaries in the state. This would be pretty easy to do via software or a program like FieldWatch. So this is nothing that couldn't be done fairly simply. Any questions about notification?
Andrew, what's involved with moving an apiary? So if you, in 2029, if your suggestion was taken up and there was an exemption granted and a nearby apiary reacted to that, what would that entail?
Well, the way it works is if I didn't move it preemptively, in other words, if I left the bees there until after the seed had been planted, what we're seeing is most of the toxic pollen is coming in during the window when the corn is planted and shortly afterwards. There's another window when the field adjacent crops are blooming in August. So the goal would be to get the bees moved out of the apiary if an exemption is granted in April or early May, before any neonic pesticides are used at all. And it would really be up to the individual beekeepers. Some beekeepers would choose to leave the bees and make the honey and take the risk of losing the bees. Some beekeepers might have some high value colonies like breeder stock or mating nucleus colonies, or something that's worth an awful lot of money, and they might choose to relocate those bees to a different registered apiary. And you would take a loss on the honey production or the queen production or whatever you were going to use in that apiary. But the beekeeper would be able to make that choice if they knew, for an example, we collected pollen in an apiary that was about 3/8 of a mile from some field crop fields that were neonic treated, and we tested fairly high levels, 9.5 parts per billion of imidacloprid and clothianidin, and by fall, all 34 of those 34 hives were dead. Not a single one was still alive. Knowing that, and having done the science to see what happens, if I were in that situation again, I would have chosen to move them in April. To answer your specific question, what that entails is going in at night with a truck, loading up all the hives and moving them to a new location, hopefully farther away from row crops. Right now, we just kind of have to deal with it. Hopefully in the future, the landscape will be less toxic. And so having these highly toxic fields will be more of an anomaly than the rule, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. that does answer the question.
Okay. And that's what I had. I'm happy to answer any other questions, especially as pertains specifically to beekeeping. If there's no other questions, then that's what I had really wanted to share.
Well, I see one other hand here, Representative O'Brien.
Andrew, I remember last year, one thing that really scared me was that besides what you just mentioned, lethal sort of neonic levels in bees and colonies, there was this sublethal activity, which, given the bees are fighting off varroa mites and other things, I think maybe Emily May or somebody else, sort of said that hives are the equivalent of nursing homes. That the bees are just not themselves. And so I wondered, anecdotally, do you see that continuing on around the state right now?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, our president from the VBA got called into Senate Ag to testify, and he was asked specifically, are your bees dying from neonics? Do you see your bees dying from neonics? And as you understand, it doesn't really work that way. It's death by 1,000 cuts. There's numerous studies showing the synergies that form when bees are neonic exposed. And any of the common pests or pathogens are already affecting them, which is 100% of the time. There are always viruses, there's always fungal pathogens, there's always parasites in the hives. And we know how to control them and we know how to manage them well. The challenge is when the bees are weakened by an exposure, which again, unlike an acute exposure like you might get with malathion or permethrin being sprayed directly on the bees, this isn't a spectacular event where you get a pile of dead bees in front of the hive. This is a death of slow attrition where the hives get smaller and smaller. And in the winter, there isn't a viable cluster going into the winter and they die sometime in the winter. Or in the case, if you see neonic levels in the pollen in anything other than fractional numbers, in other words, above 1 part per billion, they often will peter out and die before fall, before winter even comes. But levels as low as 0.02 parts per billion will start to affect the bees, reduce the productivity of the queen, cause the bees to become disoriented, cause them to be less productive in the brood nest. And these things are incredibly hard to observe unless you're a graduate student with a video camera and hundreds of hours of time to observe the bees. But what we as beekeepers do see is the effects in the hive, where we see dwindling, we see unexplained colony loss, and I'm sure all of you have read the news and seen that this year was especially hard for American beekeepers. And it isn't down to just one thing. I'm not trying to tell you that if we eliminated all neonics tomorrow, all the bees would be 100% fine. But neonics are the one problem that we have that have been specifically engineered to be exquisitely lethal to bugs. And as a bug farmer, I can tell you that restricting the use of these is going to be huge.
Just to follow up then, I guess anecdotally, are there places in Vermont where there's almost no, say, row cropping being done? Very few neonics being used, within, say, a 10 or 20 mile radius of some hives, and they're noticeably healthier.
There are areas that are less exposed to neonics. And last year we had a beekeeper from Eastern Vermont testify, I believe to House Ag, but certainly to Senate Ag, and talk about how healthy her bees were and how neonics weren't a problem. But if you look at where she's located and overlay that with a map of row cropping in Vermont, you can see that most of the row cropping is in the Champlain Valley. And bees kept on the eastern side of the state don't have the level of neonic exposure. So that testimony absolutely correlates. The UVM Bee Lab has also divided the samples that they've collected up into samples that are collected from hives that are within 2 miles of row crops and samples that have been collected that are not within 2 miles of row crops. And at this point, they haven't finished analyzing the data on survivability and colony health. But again, anecdotally, the colonies with less exposure to neonics are performing much better. There's also a great study out of Italy when they banned the neonics in the European bloc. I shared the graph during testimony, but you can see the unexplained colony deaths, and the bar is just huge. And the year after the ban went into effect, the unexplained colony deaths dropped to almost nothing. So yeah, there's plenty of science showing that synergistic and cumulative effect of neonic exposure.
Remind us again, how far do honeybees travel to collect
Well,
pollen?
honeybees will travel up to 5 miles, but in general, they prefer to forage within a mile radius of the hive. And so in Vermont, apiaries are regulated to be 2 miles apart. So if each apiary is doing most of its foraging within a mile radius, there's very little overlap between the two apiaries. And that's for 2 reasons. That's to prevent overgrazing the commons, and that's also to prevent the spread of pathogenic disease by having beeards interact with each other excessively. And so generally, if you use 1 mile away, you're going to be avoiding most of the exposure.
Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for this update. And we will, as I say, we will not be here, I think, when ICAR meets and then when it moves on to LCAR, but we'll be following things and appreciate your continued involvement in the process.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I appreciate that you folks are also tracking the process and paying close attention. Please feel free to reach out if I can be of any further service.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you all again.
So Ryan, good morning. I see you're
Yes.
joined us online. And
Morning.
Catherine, good morning. Catherine, do you want to come up to the
Sure.
table?
Nice to meet you. Hi, folks.
We have a camera here in the middle of the table.
Oh, wow, there it is. Fabulous.
A little confusing.
I've seen it from the screen, but not
Yes.
from in person. So.
So we're gonna switch into our next agenda item, and for the next half hour or so, just get a quick update from 2 representatives from our federal delegation. So welcome, Catherine, who's from Bernie Senator Sanders' office, and Ryan, who is from Senator Welch's office. And I have trouble sometimes remembering when we last saw you, but I think we've had you both in the committee maybe earlier this session, but maybe it was last year. Or maybe both.
I was here earlier for sure. Yeah, I think my colleague Haley Perro was here last.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've been of course, like everyone, watching with a certain degree of concern of things happening in Washington as they relate to agriculture, food, and forestry. We're aware of some of the cancellations in grant programs. We've heard about that earlier from other folks. We're aware that the senators have been pushing back to the extent that they can. Everyone, I think, here in the State House is concerned about what's happening right now with the budget bill, and I haven't checked the news this morning to see.
Yes.
Okay.
Just figured.
All right, so that's going to affect, I believe, an important program that we're all concerned about, of course, the SNAP program will potentially affect that. So anyway, that's my quick introduction to you, and I don't know who wants to go first. Anything you'd like to give us an update on? I think you're being pointed at there too.
Sure. Yeah, happy to start for the record. Catherine Van Hayes, State Director for Senator Sanders. I was mostly here prepared to talk about tariff impact, but happy to speak more broadly. I'll sort of start where you finished up, which is the budget reconciliation bill, which passed the House last night by a vote of 215 to 214, with one Republican congressman abstaining. Obviously, there's a lot in that. There was a 42-page amendment filed late last night, which is, I think, what led to the passage at the end. Some really terrible provisions in there, particularly related to SNAP. Huge impacts around Medicaid, other social safety net programs. We anticipate seeing a pretty substantial budget impact for the state of Vermont if this bill were to pass and become law. And obviously, Vermont, like most states, has a requirement to balance the budget. And so that hole needs to be filled. Unlike the federal government, where we can just have giant holes in our budget, obviously the state of Vermont cannot. So, if we see upwards of $100 million impact of Medicaid, that's huge burden on states. And that is true for all states, red, blue, purple, doesn't matter. And so our hope is that that information becomes clear to governors in particular. State legislators are talking about this. And so we're hopeful that that impact is clear to folks. Obviously, a huge sweeping piece of legislation with impacts in a lot of different, basically everywhere. It now heads to the Senate. Just from a sort of functional standpoint, Senator Sanders used to be ranking member of the Budget Committee, which kind of oversees this process. So we had a lot of experience in this in the past, and now as the ranking member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. His committee is responsible for a big chunk of the content of that bill, particularly as it pertains to healthcare, SNAP, and other programs, which also lives within the Agriculture Committee that Senator Welch sits on. Functionally speaking, the bill that passed the House now comes to the Senate. It is a privileged piece of legislation, so it essentially gets fast-tracked on the Senate calendar. And also because it is a budget bill, it only has a 50-vote threshold. And that is why reconciliation is used, because it lowers the threshold from 60 to 50, and it eliminates the ability for senators to filibuster the bill. That does not mean there are no hurdles. There is a low margin to pass the bill in the Senate. And there are members who have concerns about the bill, kind of on Republicans have concerns on kind of both ends of the spectrum. But we don't know at this point what the future holds for this bill. But I think the movement in the House towards pretty speedy passage at the end of the day. I mean, people as of yesterday afternoon were speculating this vote would not take place until after the Memorial Day recess. And then it happened last night. So I would not feel any level of confidence that this bill will not become law, though I do anticipate changes are possible. I don't know if it makes sense for Ryan to speak to that and then we can speak to tariffs, or.
Sure, yeah. Ryan, if you want to have anything to add to that.
Great. Ryan McLaren, Senior Advisor for Senator Welch. Katie covered most of it. I think the other thing I would add, the only thing I would add that's pertinent to this committee is that, much of what we would see trying to be accomplished in a farm bill is being thrown into this budget reconciliation process. And so we all know we've punted on a farm bill rewrite for a year when it expired last year. And so like all of the SNAP provisions that would dramatically cut food access and along with some relatively normal levels of funding for the traditional sort of mono agricultural crop commodity crop programs makes the political investment in the farm bill process much less likely to me. which is bad for everyone. That bill has been seen as more or less mandatory every 5-ish years, and is a real point of like sort of bipartisan cooperation when it does come together, and so it's hard to imagine by the end of this year taking up like that piece of legislation on its own. There might be bits and bobs that come out in isolation, but it's really sort of an unfortunate side effect of what's happening now. I think that the Farm Bill, we're not likely to pass a Farm Bill in this, at least this first year of the Congress.
Okay, back then to you. I guess.
More good news.
Yeah.
So to move to tariffs. So as the committee likely knows, on April 2nd is when President Trump announced a new round of worldwide tariffs. That obviously includes Canada. Happy going to share some data points with you that may be new, may be old information. So feel free to ask me to speed up if this is stuff you've already aware of. Currently, Vermont imports $3.5 billion worth of goods overall each year. Canada accounts for 35% of exports, 67% of imports, and 56% of total trade. So no real surprises there, but it's substantial. Currently, Vermont imports $2.4 billion of goods to Canada annually, and energy is 37% of that. So I think we all know that's a huge percentage of where we get our energy from is through Canada. Agricultural products specifically make up 30% of our imports from Canada, worth about just under $500 million, including $56 million in animal feed, and then fuel being another chunk of that. Vermont also exports $645 million of goods to Canada. Trade with Canada supports over 17,000 employees in Vermont. And 2,200 employees at Canada-owned businesses. There's also significant trade each year with Mexico and China. 75% of all of Vermont's goods are imported from Canada, Mexico, or China, and 40% of our exports go to those countries. Yale Budget Lab did a pretty comprehensive review of the tariff impact and found that the tariffs will cost Vermonters $783 million annually through their households. The agricultural disruptions are significant. I don't know if the Vermont Agency of Ag has testified before you about the tariffs specifically, but they have reported that a lot of our agricultural imports are compliant and shouldn't face tariffs, which includes maple, animal bedding, fruit and vegetables, and certain grains. However, potash, which is a fertilizer that I'm sure you all know more about than I do, is subject to a 10% tariff, and other animal feeds that are not compliant with the USMCA would also be subject to an increased price. We also know that there are antibiotic test kits that are used in the dairy industry that are seeing impacts of the tariffs already, 10% with the EU and 30% with China.
Can you just ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So did you just say food is exempt? What was that you were saying?
Yeah, so food is exempt, feed is not exempt. So for us, fruits and vegetables and certain grains and seeds are exempt, but certain animal feeds that farmers feed to animals are not exempt.
Okay. I think that's different than we've heard before, so.
Okay.
Representative O'Brien.
I just wonder, it must be really hard to do even studies or acquire data, accumulate data, given that it seemed that the percentages of what the tariffs were changing on a daily basis. And so like, I think the average person and we're, legislators, we probably know a little bit more than average, but even then it's just like, I had no idea
Yes.
You know, if, say, our lumber or timber coming back, lumber coming back, had a different tariff a month ago, does it have any tariff? Is it pause? Is it, switching daily?
Yes, I think that is absolutely correct. We're also hearing that companies are sort of putting speculative increases on products because they don't know either. So they can't say, oh, it's for sure going to be a 10% tariff. We're going to pass that tariff along to the consumer. They don't know. So they're kind of making guesses. And it's hugely disruptive to the economy overall. We also know, as just kind of a side note, most of what's crossing over between Vermont and Canada is being dealt with by US Customs. And so it's sort of what form on any given day you're supposed to use. So it's incredibly cumbersome to the federal employees at the border, to people who are crossing. What is subject on any given day seems to switch as well. And what thresholds on which the tariffs are imposed also seems to be a little bit squishy, for lack of a better word. So you're completely correct that it's extremely
Just to
volatile.
follow up, so on sort of traditional tariffs,
Yeah.
either coming or going, is it the Internal Revenue Service that's collecting those? Or border?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on how it's coming across, because there's also a role for the US Trade Administration in sort of traditional tariff implementation. And so it's really just that when it's a physical border crossing that US Customs is involved, but historically they have known, based on years of experience and training when they are in the Customs Academy, what the tariffs are, what is subject to the tariffs. They haven't changed. And so, if you or I make a drive to Canada and we come back with, something from IKEA, they know what to do with that. But things are changing at such a significant pace now that they're having trouble keeping track. I can just give you, I think, a couple more pieces of information that might be helpful. Farm machinery, I think the legislature has already dealt with some of the impacts of the increased prices of farm machinery. And according to the Farm Credit Service of America, in the last 3 decades, the average price has increased by double the rate of inflation. So we've seen increases of 287%. That will be exacerbated by these tariffs, and high fuel costs for diesel and propane, which are used significantly in the agriculture industry, have also increased. Less directly within this committee's jurisdiction, but I thought it might just be helpful for you to know. We've heard from a significant number of Vermont small businesses about the impact of these tariffs, including ones that work in the food and beverage value add industries. Gardner Supply, Caledonia Distillery, and others have been very concerned, to put it mildly, about the impact. I think the Caledonia Distillery story has made it pretty public at this point about the 120 cases of gin that they had sitting on a loading dock because they were in French. And so they had to come up with some way of being able to be permitted to sell those once the tariffs were imposed. And obviously, we're already seeing an impact to the tourism industry in Vermont that will only increase as we hit, I was going to say spring and summer months, but I'll just say warmer weather. I think that is probably a great place for me to pause and turn it over to Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I think by way of example, I was in a meeting with the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association last week, and to Katie's point, anything covered by USMCA is theoretically exempted from the additional tariffs. But if you take an evaporator, and you're making sap, a lot of those manufacturers are in Canada. If you shipped a whole evaporator across the border, theoretically that's exempted from the Canadian tariffs. But that evaporator is made up of huge chunks of metal that come from various places that are very specific to like the job they're doing. And sometimes they're made in America, sometimes they're not made in America, sometimes they're made in Canada, sometimes they're not made in Canada. And the people moving that piece of equipment, or pieces of equipment to like manufacture it and put it together, have no idea what they're going to have to pay until they get to the border, and some customs agent tells them what the tariff is today, or what sort of category a specific piece of equipment like falls under. And it's sort of I mean, it's just madness. It's absolute madness. And it would be you know, it whether, we're a border state and Canada's a huge trading partner, so the madness is sort of exceptionally impactful. That goes for the tubing that goes into providing maple syrup. So like every bit of the process here is like there is total uncertainty or extreme uncertainty. And, that's getting priced in, period. And that's not gonna, what the sort of specific tariff rate is incidental to the increased cost in these programs because of the uncertainty that's built in. So it's not good. I think I'm trying not to be the sort of final the bad news deliverer, really, as a mostly for my own benefit. So I think what has been, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say uplifting, but the sort of momentum we've been gaining talking about this in our office and Senator Sanders' office, and just like as a delegation, is like we're hearing about it from everyone. And so the what is quite useful for us, and you all will see this in your districts, obviously, as you go home and hear about it from constituents, is like the breadth and depth of the impact is important. And the stories we hear from small businesses across the state about impacts that don't jump to the top of the list. It's not like a big gross trade number about like forest products or agricultural products. It's like this specific cookie cutter that's made in Rutland is going to be more expensive, and it will has an impact on the community there. So those stories are really helpful in demonstrating to our colleagues about the impact, or our boss's colleagues down in DC, and we have some traction there. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I would encourage you all to share with us the things that you're hearing, because that's as important as anything in trying to push back on some of the negatives.
Representative Bosland.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think the maple syrup examples are really relevant because, as we know, like we hear from those folks too, and there's a lot of producers in Vermont that are in that category. I actually watched a short film that was done by NOFA Vermont that was profiling one particular producer. And in addition to the examples that you mentioned in terms of ways maple syrup could be impacted, that particular producer also got their nice glass bottles from Italy.
Yes.
So their bottles were being tariffed as well as the parts they needed for manufacturing. And so it just, on so many levels, we can have damages from the tariffs in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of, like, oh, maple syrup won't have a tariff. Well, all the pieces that support selling the maple syrup are.
Right. That's a very specific bottle to maple. There's one company that manufactures them in the United States, and they can't do enough for all of Vermont's maple syrup. And maple's like it's a good example because it is also like, Vermont is not a commodity agriculture. We're not California. Like, so much of our agricultural value and economy is tied to our place. And the impacts on tourism ripple out into the agricultural world in a way that is probably not true in some of the bigger, more sort of like production ag states. And so, like, Hill Farmstead has lost 30% of their business since these tariffs went into place because of the social impact on what we're communicating to our Canadian neighbors and the cost of, paying 25% more or whatever more when you cross the border into Canada, of reciprocal tariffs. And so the yeah, the tourism bit is certainly um, has a huge impact on our agricultural space. Huge.
Let's get back to the budget reconciliation bill. Can you give us a sense of how long it might take for the Senate uh, to act one way or the other?
No, I can't. I think they'd do it tonight if they could, and that's the question. It's like, um, but where that lands, it's it matters what is in the changes that happened overnight. I don't
Yep.
think anyone on our team certainly has had the chance to
You haven't had a
digest
chance
what
to,
that
yeah.
means.
I think to Ryan's point, it is largely, the timing will largely be dependent about when they have the votes. So if they have the votes today, there is nothing, because it has this privileged status, I think they could put it on the calendar very quickly, more quickly than they could anything else. But there are still a few sort of technical hurdles to that. But it will take longer if they don't have the votes. And I tend to be of the opinion, though this is not a fact, that the longer the legislation sits out there and the longer that people have the opportunity to review it and raise concerns about it, the more challenging it may be, but the pressure to pass it is going to be substantial. And it's also it's also possible that the Senate could make changes to it and then it would need to be sent back to the House. But I think there is a lot of pressure to get this across the finish line into the president's desk.
I remember reading several weeks ago that the particular specific to the SNAP program, that there was a suggestion, and I'm not sure whether that's in there or not, that states, that some of the responsibility for administration of it be shifted to states. So not just the benefit change, whatever that might end up looking like, but that there may be a burden now on state government that doesn't currently exist.
I will look at the latest bill. I'll ask our team to look at it. It wouldn't surprise me. I don't know the answer for you. It wouldn't surprise me that it's a general sort of like cost savings, which is just projecting the cost down. So it wouldn't surprise me one bit. But I do think on the timeline, like I said, our most value, we have a microphone. That's like our main power at this point in like institutional power. And so we're trying to communicate as broadly as we can the potential impacts here. And so like having some sense of what you all think and you're the sort of the potential impact of these cuts, of any cuts, and the value of SNAP to Vermont and Vermonters and your constituents, that's a really helpful message for us as we enter this phase of persuasion, potential persuasion, with our other Senate offices in DC, because it's not just Vermont that's impacted here. And the more we can raise awareness and share some common stories about what happens on the ground in these programs, the better.
Representative O'Brien and then Representative Boston.
Brian and Katie, could you speak, sort of echoing what you were just articulating, Ryan, about the farm worker situation, because that's going to affect red and blue states and dairy in general, which is, a nonpartisan economy.
I am happy to, but I don't want to. If you want to, Katie, I would like. Well, yeah, I don't want to.
Go ahead,
Okay.
I'll follow with
Yeah,
anything.
we are. It's awful. Um, and what happened to those farm workers? It's a real existential threat. Obviously to those families, to the communities that those people live in, and they're an integral part of, and to farm businesses. And I've heard from all of those people like real fear and concern. And so we are very interested in finding a way in the short term, even in this administration, to um, get to a place where farm workers can achieve a legal status in the country and on farms. I have some, if I'm hopeful about anything these days, like there's a window of opportunity there, and there are senators, Midwestern senators and House members who are like the chair of the House Agriculture Committee is talking about finding ways to give dairy migrant labor on dairy farms legal status, and that's a positive sign. Like that's a person or a Republican of stature that is at least trying to engage in this question, and I know Peter is motivated to do the same. And so where that lands, I don't know. But there's a real effort happening to sort of protect um, folks working on farms that have been, um, you know, doing the right thing and providing for us all.
Representative Boston?
Yeah, I guess this would be for Ryan since Senator Welch is on the Agriculture Committee. So we know the SNAP cuts would come out of the current budget, and that's following the really dramatic USDA cuts that already happened. And I'm just wondering, sort of in the pulling at straws and hoping for good news category, is there anything coming through on the federal side that would perhaps replace or plan for things like replacing the farm to school kind of programs or local produce purchasing? I mean, because that part was really damaged by some of the cuts that happened already. And I'm just wondering, before we go home, which for us, Lord only knows, but maybe within a week and a half, what can you tell us that we can tell people who are concerned about these issues?
Sure. I think there are two other bits of, there's a lot. There is in theory, there is disaster supplemental funding through USDA that should be like rolling out into flood impacted communities from 2023.
We still think that's coming because we've been hearing that for 6 months. So
I know we have, and
Okay.
we keep hearing it's coming, and
Okay.
so we keep telling them to deliver. So I do think there's not a lot of ways out, but some of the discretionary fund. So I do think that will come. I'm hopeful, and we're going to keep pushing for it as soon as humanly possible. That's one bucket of funding. Some of the really discretionary stuff, like some of the local food purchase programs, RFSI, that was came from the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is essentially like a USDA's bank and is pretty discretionary. I have very little confidence that's coming back. We've been told that is going to fight bird flu, and one, I don't believe that, and two, like we've seen a dramatic reduction in bird flu cases, and like that crisis is sort of stabilizing, which is positive, is generally positive. But that's not because this administration is spending money on that was supposed to go to local food purchasing on the bird flu. And so that's just an excuse in my mind, and I don't know. They have discretion, so there's only so much we can do to sort of push on that. What I would say is, like, for example, at this Maple Sugar Makers Association meeting, that community relies heavily on a grant through AMS, the ag marketing service called ACER. And that the administration had sort of frozen that grant program. It didn't open it for grants, which usually happens in the first few months of the year. And we've been told, like, in order to sort of ensure compliance with any number of executive orders that have been issued in the first few days of the first few months of the administration, and we have been told that they're expecting to open that grant program again. And so, some of the non-discretionary, more like the same has been true. We've been told the same with the Leahy Farm to School program, which is written in a law, is not a function of discretion, like the secretary's discretion. And so they are required to reopen it. And so some of those more routine programs are opening back up. But some of the like IRA funding and the more discretionary stuff is not.
Thank you.
If I can just briefly add, I think in terms of the timing question about the fact that you all will likely be going home to your constituents at some point in the near future, and people are going to have a lot of questions about all of these programs and all of these cuts. I think, from where Senator Sanders sits, a lot of this is kind of keeping it high level to some extent and not getting too deep in the weeds, because I think it's very overwhelming for all of us, let alone our constituents. And the reality here is, I think a lot of what we're seeing is it's death by 1,000 cuts, but all the cuts cross over each other, right? If you make cuts to SNAP, you add work requirements to SNAP, you're potentially cutting LIHEAP, home heating assistance. We have the funding we need right now for LIHEAP, but we know that that's one of the programs targeted by President Trump. And even if we get it, the likelihood we get it on time for Vermont winters is going to be substantially at risk. There are proposed cuts to the Northern Border Regional Commission, the total elimination of that organization. That would have significant impacts to Vermont. The impacts of the attacks on farm workers, the food service industry, Medicaid, you name it, it's across the board and it's going to hit everybody. And I think what I would sort of suggest is that no single one of us, either around this table or our constituents, is going to come out of this better off. Economically, socially, environmentally, everyone is going to be hurt. I think probably we could count on one hand the number of Vermonters who will be benefited by the tax cuts that are in the current proposal. And really, everyone will be hurt by this one way or another. And so finding the ways to band together to explain the harm is going to be particularly important. But I think this is a place where we're coming together, I think, is vital to make it clear that we will all be affected.
One thing that we can do, where we can think about doing next week, is putting together a letter expressing whatever concerns we might have to the delegation, so that you have that then to share with your bosses, colleagues. To the extent that you can share as details come out.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's only been however long, I don't know when the bill passed, 12 hours, maybe less. But on the SNAP program, for example, and other things that, will have an impact.
Absolutely.
Direct impact.
Yeah, the Senate committees will be putting together their summaries of the impacts, so we can forward those along to you and get any specific. One of the things we always ask for is what's the state by state impact, because the national numbers are good, but it's better when we can see the impacts to the state. And I think to the extent where state legislatures are also sharing that information with not just their federal delegation, but their governors, and making sure their governors are tracking this information is particularly beneficial as well, because it really is the states who are going to be left dealing with the impact of all of these changes.
Thank you both for making time this morning, and I'm sure you've got a lot to do, so we'll let you go. We are, we're gonna have Mike O'Grady. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Ryan.
I think what we'll do is have Mike come up to the table and get set up. Mike, do you have a side, not a side by side, but the amendment, something anyway that you can
I'm
show
gonna
us?
do any like statewide
Uh,
in tours, updating people at some point. I mean, I know in the past. we've lost, but
Yeah, so we're doing some virtual things just to get to